GHD contract for the pump station and wastewater treatment plant review.
Good. Wonderful. Feeling good about the contractor?
Yeah, GHD's a good.
Have you worked with them before?
Press has a long history, and they're the ones who did the Rehoboth Beach, Ocean Outfall, and they've done a lot of work. They're a national company.
Right. Perfect. Well, that'll be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, it is 4 o'clock. How we doing there, Janelle?
A couple people just came in.
Okay. Are we on yet? There's Kristen.
We have 7 members present.
And we have 2 here.
Not included.
Oh, you included them, okay. Okay. I know Marta said she was going to be on.
Marta's here.
Yep, there she
Marta's
is.
here, Candace is here. Chris is here.
There's something in the Q&A.
No, it's Marta. I take that back. A couple of people just haven't turned on their.
Okay. Okay, looks like we got some more people just joined.
And Frank are both on, they just don't have their cameras on.
Schedule.
Sure. Who is?
Jen Baker and Frank Young are both on.
They're both on?
Oh, is that, yeah.
Cameras is not on.
Okay. Who is not?
Their cameras on.
Yeah, their camera's on. I thought you said somebody. There's Frank, he's on now.
Those keep
Okay.
The change of seasons has a really bizarre impact on me, too. I didn't sleep at all last night. I kept waking up with, like, stuffy nose. It was just bizarre.
Well, normally my allergies are in June, July from grasses.
Right.
But this year, it's, I'm still picking tomatoes.
I picked some Saturday.
I told my mother last night,
That's pretty
I'm
nuts.
bringing fresh tomatoes home for Thanksgiving.
I think I turned mine into fried green tomatoes on Saturday.
Yum.
We're at 9 members total at the moment.
Okay.
In a quorum.
Okay, well, I think we probably should go ahead and get started. Are we,
Yes.
okay. So good afternoon, Jen and Phil and everybody else here. Here in the room, we have Khalil and Tom Panetta, and of course, Anne Marie and Janelle and myself. It looks like we're still missing a couple of people. Hopefully, they'll join us very soon. Okay? But I think we do need to go ahead, in the interest of time and respect for everybody else, we need to go ahead and get started. So, before we get started, I just want to sort of talk for a moment about the way this committee got started and what the expectation is for it. When we set this committee up, we were looking to make sure that we had a forward-looking perspective on sea level rise and climate change. And so we've spent a lot of time, and we'll continue to spend more time today talking about the background and the history of where we are and what's going on currently. But going forward, when we finally start talking about recommendations, and I think that will happen very soon, we need to be looking forward. What should we be doing? What should this community be adopting as guidance for sea level rise and climate change, and how do we manage it? The anticipation is that if we fail to do that, we could see several things happen to us in the long run, not the least of which would be our relationship with NFIP. It could impact our bond rating. It could impact our ability to get insurance. Could result in devaluation of properties. And other potential things. I think we've already seen that a lot of insurance companies have stopped writing insurance in the state of Delaware. And fortunately, we have a very good relationship with Trident for the city on property and casualty, but that's not to say that we might not have future problems going forward. So the work of this committee and the recommendations we put forward for council to consider, and whatever action council finally ends up taking, is really needs to be looking forward as to how do we address the potential the potential risks associated with climate change and sea level rise. So with that sort of as a background, I think I'll turn this over to Jen and Phil, and we can go ahead and get started. Jen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and welcome everyone. Good to see you as always. Just a quick overview of our meeting today. After our last meeting where we reviewed best.
Oh, we got an echo.
You see that? Is this any better? Okay, let's try this. Here we go. Is that any better?
Much. That's great.
There we go. Okay, let's try that. Sorry about that.
No problem.
One way to get people's attention, right?
Sounded like my alarm
After our
clock.
last meeting, we talked about best practices in other places. I have just one short addendum to that presentation before we jump into, Charlie O'Donnell is here. He's going to give us an overview of the city's stormwater management system, and that is a result of, the end of last meeting that we had really delve into some engineering solutions, which is really not what this committee is about. We want more community-wide solutions, not just site-specific. And so Charlie is going to give us an overview of the city's stormwater system as a whole, and then we're going to delve back into the regulations with Janelle, and instead of looking at communities from other areas, she's going to actually take some of those zoning regulations and compare them with some adjoining your sister coastal cities in Delaware, and part of a study that was done a few years ago by the Resilient Community Partnership. So the first thing I'm going to do is just real quick share my screen. I'm not sure what happened at the last meeting. My computer froze, and so I just didn't get to this last slide. And I wanted to make sure that I shared it with you because we did, we looked at zoning. We looked at Norfolk, City of Norfolk zoning. There we go. As well as subdivision. There it goes. Okay. Can everybody see that? Can I get a...
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. We looked at subdivision regulations and the idea of permeable paving and open space regulations. We also looked at funding strategies. Talked about the stormwater management, utility fees, as well as the resiliency fund that the city of Bethany Beach has, as well as Sussex County's funding mechanism. And so this slide kind of falls under the other considerations, right? These are just other innovations that places have done that make them more resilient. And the first one comes out of Nags Head, North Carolina, and they have what they call their storm reconstruction ordinance. And as it says here, basically this puts a temporary pause on the issuance of building permits after a storm event, especially a significant storm event. And it starts out just as a very short period, but it allows the city a chance to breathe and take stock of what has just happened and plan and put some thought into how they are going to redevelop and what the priority areas are for redevelopment. It does have kind of a phased approach, and so that was one of the potential areas to look at. It is an ordinance, it's something the city adopts, so it's a regulation, but it's different than the zoning and the subdivision regulation. Another one that's a different approach is real estate disclosures. And so we've seen these recently in the states of Hawaii and California. There's also several small towns in South Carolina around Hilton Head that are adopting these, and it basically requires that realtors disclose the potential for sea level rise as a part of any real estate transaction. And so that is something, another tool in our toolbox, so to speak, that you all can consider as we move this conversation forward. And so we'll stop that. And I apologize for not adding them at the end of the last meeting, but we can, again, consider them as we move forward. Any questions or thoughts on those couple additions? Nope. Okay. So with that, I am going to hand the mic over to Charlie, and we're going to dive into stormwater. So thank you, Charlie, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Is it possible to share my screen? Yes,
Yes.
it is. Oh, gotcha. Here it is. Great. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right, so I'm just going to give a summary overview of the city BPW stormwater system, how it stands now, some interesting, just interesting facts and interesting natural conditions that the board and the city deal with every single day.
Charlie, do you want to see your notes, or do you want the actual slides to appear larger?
Yeah, I want them to be larger.
There's that PowerPoint thing in the middle at the bottom. If you click on that, that's it.
Gotcha.
That might bring it up, maybe not. There's something that will do it in the previous screen anyway.
Huh.
Maybe that one,
Yeah, if you go back to the previous screen you had before this came up.
it was larger.
That's larger.
No.
End the slides show and start over, Charlie.
Go backwards from like when you were beginning. I mean,
Gotcha.
like back out of it, yeah.
At the top, hit end slideshow.
And slideshow. Yeah.
Is that better? Or?
Yeah, now go to the bottom of the screen. You see that little chart towards the right bottom? That's it.
Yeah.
Click
Gotcha.
that.
Is that bigger for you?
It didn't do it. It didn't move there. Try and click it again. It's still...
It's weird. I haven't had that problem before.
Okay.
Charlie, if you want to go back, I can bring it up and you just tell me when to change the slides.
I guess I was hoping I could do this.
It seems like it didn't take you a click when you tried to click on that presentation at the bottom right. Yeah, click it.
Yeah, it's not working.
Still doing it, huh?
Okay. Maybe we better let Janelle do it, that way we get the full screen.
Okay.
Thanks, Charlie.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
That's right.
You bringing it up, Janelle?
Yep.
There it is.
There it is.
I just need to
Okay.
share it
Um,
with Zoom.
right.
Okay. Okay.
All right, you should be good to go, Charlie.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
We can.
Okay. So just if you'd advance it to the next slide. Sorry about this. Yeah, so just, basic overview. I think it's important for everybody to know that the Board of Public Works did have a complete study and modeling effort of its stormwater management system done in 2014. I know there's been some things that have been added to the system and some things that have been eliminated, but it's a pretty good record of what exactly is going on with the stormwater system inside the city of Lewes. Just some facts and figures. The city's 4.5 square miles in size, approximately 2,900 acres. The way it works inside the city is that the Board of Public Works maintains the catch basin and piping systems, and the city maintains the streets, curbs, and gutters. in terms of operation and maintenance costs and on capital projects, et cetera. Some things that really factor into our stormwater system are what the elevations are. On the city side of the canal, elevations vary from 10 to 14 based on NAVD 88 benchmark, and which are good. Those are really pretty good elevations. Until you go right down by the canal, there's pretty good elevation on the city side. Can't say the same for the beach side. It's odd to actually that the beach, Lewes Beach, tends generally to be at a higher elevation, and the beach side moves to lower grades as you move towards the Lewes-Rehoboth Canal, which is, it might be counterintuitive, but it's just the way it is out there. The beach side's a little higher than the canal side of the beach side of Lewes Beach. Like I said, there was a study done in 2014. 975 catch basins were identified, along with junction boxes, outfall locations. We were surprised when that study was made that we discovered that there's 25 outfalls to the Lewes-Rehoboth Canal for stormwater. Just as some background, back in the old days before there was a Lewes wastewater treatment plant, and this is typical of most small municipalities across our region, across the country, there was what we called combined sewer. It was stormwater and sanitary sewer, and they all went through outfalls to the canal. But before the wastewater plant, as part of the wastewater plant project back in 1961, what we call in the engineering business an interceptor pipe was laid all the way along the canal that collected sewage, and it was split off from the stormwater over time, and rerouted that sanitary sewage, domestic sewage, et cetera, to the wastewater treatment plant, so that now only the 25 outfalls to the canal only outfall stormwater discharge. So that's important to note. But another thing about those 25 outfalls is that they're not all the same drainage shed, not the same size acreage of area going through each one of those outfalls. The city has some drainage sheds that are pretty large, others that are really small, like basically 2 catch basins and a discharge to the canal. So it doesn't have that much acreage of drainage going into them. So just be aware that not every one of those is flowing the same amount of runoff to the canal during a rainstorm. The city also has 7 outfalls to the Canary Creek watershed. Ones to keep in mind are like the Highland Acres tax ditch, Pilottown Village and the reserve at Pilottown discharge to Canary Creek. There's a system from DeVries Circle, the Drake Knoll development, portions of Savannah Road and McPhee Street that all end up going into the Canary Creek drainage into the creek rather than going to the canal. So there's 7 of those also as part of the drainage system across the city. There's some runoff from the Babe Reeves Estates and part of the Kings Highway, Freeman Highway confluence, the Y there at the lighthouse. Part of that goes into the Delaware River and Bay Authority DelDOT system on Freeman Highway, and it's handled that way. That drawing that I'm showing at the bottom of that is just, and I can share that with the committee, but it's the overall map that was created in the 2014 study by Duffield and Associates that showed all the piping and the discharge points into the canal and the Canary Creek system. So it's interesting to look at that. Okay, Janelle. So I thought it might be good as an overview of the whole city stormwater system to just review not all of the watersheds, but some of the major ones and some of the interesting ones. So this one's really interesting. It's what I call the Washington Avenue outfall watershed. The outfall is at the foot of Washington Avenue near the city's maintenance building. And there's actually two 36-inch pipes that collect all the drainage from that outlined area. So you can see that's about 70 acres. A lot of those streets, a lot of those homes, a lot of that impervious area ends up at the foot of Washington Avenue. And when the city redesigned Washington Avenue in 1999, as part of that project, two 36-inch pipes were put at the foot of Washington Avenue, collecting all that rainfall runoff at the bottom of Washington Avenue. If you've ever been down there, it slopes straight down to the bike trail. So right before the bike trail on the Washington Avenue side, it collects all that drainage, runs it through twin 36-inch HDPE pipes, and it ties into a 24-inch pipe, unusually, but it does tie into a 24-inch pipe going under Freeman Highway that was existing as part of the Freeman Highway project. There is, when I say it ties in, it actually discharges from the two 36-inch pipes into some vegetated area that allows for infiltration before it goes to that 24-inch. We haven't ever had a backup that I'm aware of since we did this project. It crosses underneath Freeman Highway. It goes through a rather large ditch that eventually ends up into another ditch that discharges into the canal, sort of down from the Freeman Highway bridge. You can see where it is on the map. But it's an interesting, it's a large watershed, and it's interesting that it's got such an outfall, you know. It's not that complicated, but it's more complicated than a lot of them where it goes directly into the canal. This one has to go through some pipes, has to go through some ditches, and eventually finds its way to the canal. Okay, Janelle. GMB did a study, I want to say 10, 12 years ago now, on the Savannah Road end of the beach side, and you can see our area of study in that red delineation, the map shown on the left. It actually, those were areas where we were having problems of stormwater backing up during storms into those cul-de-sacs that are actually within that red outlined area. And we were able to come up with some solutions that help alleviate some of that rising rain runoff getting into those cul-de-sacs and creating problems. It does require continual maintenance of the old mosquito ditches that are in the marsh area there at the end of the cul-de-sacs. And we also identified some other improvements that some of them have been done and some of them are yet to do, but they're on the capital project list for the city and the board. All that runoff from that red outlined area and actually the cul-de-sacs of Lewes and Rehoboth Avenue as well, and parts of Anglers Road, all end up going through a 24-inch discharge to the canal that's directly adjacent to the bridge. It's on the Anglers Road side of the Savannah Road bridge going over the canal. The one thing that's interesting about this, and I know we've had some amount of focus on the beachside drainage throughout this process. One thing that's, we have to keep in mind is that the mean high tide is at elevation 2.7, but, like I said before, you have low grade elevations on the beach side that range from 2 to 11, so you're not going to have too many problems from rain issues maybe up towards the beach. But if you have a catch basin that's down around elevation 3 on one of these cul-de-sacs or one of the streets leading from Cedar Avenue towards the canal, or even on Cedar Avenue, if it happens to be on a low spot, you might have some issues if there's a higher than mean tide. And even on mean high tides, it's just something that's very important to consider when we think about drainage on the beach side, that it can't just be anticipated that we're going to put in a catch basin pipe collection system like we have on the city side, and it's going to work without any issues, because the grades are just so low over there that we've got to consider the tidal backup into those pipes and what the effects of that would be, even if you have some sort of check valve at the end of the pipe discharge.
Charlie, do you know what high tide is?
Yeah, I've got that data. It runs like over 4, near about 5 times. Yeah, I can get you that data though. We've run that data several times. Okay, Janelle. So another very interesting drainage shed is the one that collects rainwater from the Nebraska-Iowa Avenue area on Cedar Avenue, out by the Lewes Yacht Club. It's not a very big drainage area, but it's one that we did 20 years ago and combined effectively the use of porous asphalt pavement on the streets and a catch basin on Nebraska Avenue that collects anything that doesn't infiltrate through the porous pavement, collects it and discharges it into the canal as shown on that plan at the bottom. And I wanted to show you this one because I feel like when we begin to address the beachside stormwater issues across the entire length of the beachside, I feel like I need to look at it obviously in total, but I feel like this is going to be part of how we approach it, is that we combine all sorts of infiltration and best management practices, certainly permeable pavement where we can, with the occasional outfall as an insurance policy against runoff creating flooding problems. There are flooding problems on the beach that aren't necessarily caused by rain runoff. We're all aware of the surge tidal issues, and I'll get into that a little bit at the end. But I just wanted to show you this one because it's something that the city did and the board did 20 years ago that's been effective. I mean, if you go out on Nebraska Avenue during a rainstorm, very little even gets to the catch basin that's near Cedar Avenue, but whatever it does ends up going through that system, getting to the canal.
Charlie, can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you talk about porous asphalt paving, how does that compare to just regular sand or soil? I'm sure both of those are different, but I mean, is it almost as porous, or are we kind of half and half between full pavement and normal soil?
Yeah, so a porous asphalt has a slightly less, what we call runoff curve number than just a sandy soil. But it's a system. It's not just the asphalt on top that's porous. It is a special mix of asphalt that allows rain to run through it, infiltrate through it. But it's also got a whole system of stone and underneath that asphalt that is porous, and the whole system, the stone underneath of it, works together to create that infiltration that's so effective. I can tell you this, when we did Bay Avenue in 2011, 2012, and we ran infiltration tests on the newly installed porous asphalt system with the porous asphalt and that underlying engineered base stone system, we were getting at the beginning, on the average across the whole length, almost a mile and a half of Bay Avenue, an average of over 50 inches per hour of drainage through the porous asphalt. So when you think about that in terms of like a storm that, even a heavy storm is like 3 inches per hour. So you're you're able to get that water through. That said, Marta, it doesn't stay at that performance level forever because, it's traveled upon, there's sand that gets into some of the pores. It requires maintenance, which the city does on a regular basis. So when we tested it several years later, that performance had dropped down to like 10 inches per hour, which is still excellent.
Okay.
Sussex Conservation District only requires like 3 inches per hour for you to use a best management practice infiltration system of any kind, not just porous pavement. So we're still way above that threshold where they would even allow us to use it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
So when we did Bay Avenue, just to let you know, we looked at putting in a catch basin and piping system, a full catch basin and piping system across the entire beach side. And back in 2010, when we ran that estimate, it was like a $4.1 million project. I put 2.5% inflation factor and a future value to make it like $5.5 million project now. But I have a feeling it might even be higher than that, especially given the current bidding climate. And it's just, given the tide versus grade elevations on the beach side, those problems that we might encounter, and the effectiveness of infiltration devices on the sandy soils generally on the beach side, it just wasn't a cost-effective approach. And we were only looking at Bay Avenue at the time, so we ended up doing Bay Avenue completely from one end to the other in porous asphalt. We worked with George and Lynch, who's the asphalt company, and developed a mix which has actually been refined over the years, and it's been really effective. And that's something to keep in mind when we look at porous streets, that they have a dual purpose. They're the road for travel, for vehicles, but they're also part of the stormwater management system. So keep that in mind too. I know we've been talking with the city and the board about doing a stormwater study on the beach side, and it's under consideration now to approach DNRC. They have a surface water matching planning grant where it's a 50-50 matching grant for just these kinds of studies. Got to talk to Anne Marie and Austin Calaman about doing that, but we've started to think about that. Okay, Janelle. So anybody who's been down by the lightship overfalls, if you look closely in their dock area, there's a 48-inch corrugated pipe discharge, and that's stormwater discharge. And the rainfall runoff that goes through that pipe when it rains comes from the watershed I've identified, generally in the outlined area, a large watershed of 110 acres. Remember, the one over at Washington Avenue was 70 acres. This one's even larger. It's 110 acres. It encompasses catch basins, all along those streets that are inside the outlined area, that collect it in pipes and run it by gravity down to that 48-inch discharge at the canal. I just wanted to show you this one because it is the largest drainage shed in the area. It collects water that runs across the George H.P. Smith Park, all those streets that are inside that area. It's a big one. I just wanted you to be aware of that. And just, note that there's 20 other discharges similar to that 48-inch one. 48's the largest in the city. The other 20 are generally much smaller in size, some as much as just, 12 inches or even 8 inches in some locations. But so there's 20 other discharges on the city side from smaller drainage sheds, which I kind of alluded to earlier. Okay, Janelle. So when we talk about the beach side, I think it's important for the committee to remember that there's 40 streets, so there's quite a number of, cross-connection streets between Bay Avenue and Cedar, and then all those streets that go from Cedar towards the canal. And they total 40. And you have to add on top of that, huge streets of Cedar Avenue, Bay Avenue, Bayview Avenue, Massachusetts Avenue, Market Street, Midland Avenue, and the alleyways between the main streets that I know have been under discussion. All of those streets are city maintained except for Cedar Avenue, which is a DelDOT maintained road. So when we talk about what we're going to do drainage-wise on Cedar Avenue, DelDOT would be included in that discussion. This is what we've discovered through the years, is that the soils are generally sandy on the beach side, especially as you move towards the beach. But as you move towards the canal marsh, the soils aren't nearly as permeable. And I always advise the city and the board to just be careful when we talk about permeable paving, porous paving. It's not a fit everywhere. And there may be certain sections, especially on the streets leading from Cedar Avenue towards the canal, where it's not a good candidate at all. But we're able to test for that prior to design or during our design. We do infiltration tests. We have professional geotechnical scientists come out and run infiltration tests. They tell us what the potential is for infiltration through the underlying soils, and then we determine from that whether it's possible to even use permeable paver if it's going to be effective or not.
Charlie, this is Khalil. Can you hear me?
Yeah, who is it?
Khalil?
Khalil. Hey, how you doing, Khalil?
Good. I'm fine, thanks. Hey, just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt, but obviously it's clear that Bay Avenue is all permeable. But I did notice there's, I think 4 streets here, side streets, that are also seem to be permeable. Can you explain why those streets are permeable?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The one to the right on the page is New Hampshire Avenue,
Okay.
and it was actually installed as permeable porous asphalt. You're not going to believe this, in 1992. So coming up on 30 years ago. It still performs. I haven't run an infiltration test on it recently, but it's still a well-performing porous asphalt. As far as I know, we don't have a whole lot of drainage issues on New Hampshire Avenue. The two all the way to the left nearest the inlet
Right.
are Nebraska and Iowa, which I talked about before. We did those, generally, Khalil, because we were having problems with runoff at those local locations back in the early 2000s and mid-2000s, like 2005 when we did Iowa Avenue. So it was determined that we would do those in porous asphalt. And then we also tested Odessa Avenue. That's another project that's been porous asphalt for nearly 20 years now.
Okay.
It's, call me conservative, but when I do these projects, I like to have a little bit of insurance and not necessarily depend entirely on the porous potential of the asphalt. And Odessa Avenue is a good example. It has what we call an inverted crown, so the middle of the street is actually slightly lower than the edges of the street, and it allows the runoff to collect, and anything that doesn't go through the porous asphalt on Odessa ends up just draining towards the marsh at the foot of Odessa Avenue.
Got it.
So that's a little bit of the history there.
That's great, Charlie. Thank you so much, because I was just curious. It seemed kind of arbitrary, but you explained it well. Thank you.
Sure thing. And I did want to show this map like this and outline these areas because, and I know Bay Avenue is the bulk of it, but 44% of the 21,000 linear feet of roads on the beach side are already in porous on the beach side. And that does not include the DelDOT maintained Cedar Avenue. So however long that is, which it's probably almost 8,000 feet, you'd have to add to that 21,000.
Charlie, it's Ted. You might also mention the fact how you handle Bay View as it comes off of Market.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Ted. Yeah. Pretty proud of that one, actually, because they were having significant drainage issues, even in minor to heavy storm areas. Thank you, Janelle. And I guess we did it maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We replaced the pavement that was there. And remember when I was talking about that we've been refining this porous asphalt mix. The underlying base stone didn't change much, but the mix itself did. And it's just such a performing street. You can go out there during the heaviest of storms, and I don't think you'll see a bit of water on Bayview Avenue, which is, in that case, I did, again, the conservative in me, we did design it with it's got what we call a slope from one side to the other. So it slopes from the houses towards the dune on the beach side. So whatever doesn't go through the porous asphalt ends up just running off into that sandy soil on the dune side of Bayview Avenue. It's just worked really well.
It's 100% improvement.
I just point those insurance policies out to you because when the city and the board look to redesign some of these areas on the beach side, those are the kind of things that we need to think about just to make sure that we're covered beyond just, saying, hey, we got a poor street out there that's going to work. Okay, Janelle. Yeah, so I thought talking about the beach side might be a decent transition to talk about some of the things that the city and the board have been working on regarding surge tide vulnerability in the city. Definitely on the beach side. A study was done back in 2015. Its focus was on critical facilities and evacuation routes. And part of what we identified as really vulnerable areas were the ones that I've bullet pointed here. The west end of Cedar Avenue. There's a picture on the left-hand side from Winter Storm Jonas, which you might be interested to know was actually the highest water elevation on record, was Winter Storm Jonas. Not a hurricane, not a nor'easter, but Winter Storm Jonas, which was interesting, I thought. But that's a decent picture. You can get an idea of the kind of flooding that occurs during storm surge tides at that, end towards the inlet, not all the way to the inlet, but like sections from Michigan Avenue all the way out to Nebraska Avenue. It gets really badly flooded. And, interestingly enough, I know we've talked about this before at the committee level, but that flooding doesn't occur from the Delaware Bay. It occurs from the Lewes-Rehoboth Canal. And it comes back up through the marsh. When those nor'easters or other storms have that northeast wind and push in from the inlet and raise the water elevation in the canal and also Canary Creek, it ends up coming back around on West Cedar Avenue. The city is just about wrapped up with a DEMA-funded flood mitigation study where we're looking at creating devices or alternatives that would allow for normal tides to come in from the Rehoboth Canal to feed the wetlands that exist back there healthily, which was a very important consideration in the study, was to keep those healthy wetlands thriving, but eliminate, when we know there's going to be a storm surge, eliminate those storm surges from pushing through whatever alternative is selected and getting onto West Cedar Avenue and flooding the backs of homes and things of that nature that occur right now. So I wanted to make the committee aware of that's going on, and if there's an alternative that's feasible and also desirable from the city, the board, DEMA, we would pursue FEMA funds for the actual construction of that alternative through their brick funding apparatus. So that's all in the works. I wanted to make the committee aware of that. Another area, the picture to the right is New Road. That was Winter Storm Jonas. You can't really tell it very good from that picture, but we all know that when you drive down there, even today, when I drove by around 1:30 or so, the tide was high. I was expecting it to be even worse today with the nor'easter, but I think the nor'easter hit a little bit north of us, worse than it hit us, but the tide was still high, and it was starting to reach onto the shoulder of the road at the Canary Creek Bridge. So probably everybody's aware by now that DelDOT's in the middle, right smack dab in the middle of designing a new bridge, which is going to have, some significant effects in terms of the raising the bridge, so they've got to transition back down to New Road on both sides. So it's going to take a little bit of transition area. So it's going to change some things up, but it's also going to eliminate flooding of New Road, which is identified as an evacuation route for the city. Other areas that we need still to work on a lot and coordinate with DelDOT, Savannah Road from the bridge to Cape End Open Drive, generally from the bridge to American Legion Road is the worst case, in front of the various shopping centers and hotels out on that segment of Savannah Road. We need to dig into that a little bit with DelDOT. Not a whole lot's been accomplished there. We did perform that study that I brought up earlier for catch basins and pipe that runs in front of all those shopping centers. There's some improvements that can be done there that might help it some, but we're talking about tidal surge here. So that's something that needs to be talked about and worked with DelDOT. Also, Tom Panetta has brought this to my attention several times, but the Pilottown Road at the end near Canary Creek, as you cross over to get to the Denrick boatyard over there on that side, that gets bad, and that's mainly because, again, that's Canary Creek that floods, and it just manifests itself there at the Canary Creek Bridge as you move in that direction. So that's another area. I know there's one particular area that probably everybody's interested in. If you ever have a hankering to go to Dairy Queen and it's raining, everybody knows how bad it gets from Dairy Queen to Virginia Avenue, which is the backside of the beach parking lot, that road that leads to the backside. Everybody understands how bad it gets. And I often get the question, well, there's catch basins out there, but they're really not catch basins. They're just infiltration basins that continually get sanded out and are just difficult to maintain. So the good news is, we found this out when we were looking at doing something at Alaska Avenue. DelDOT is actually working on a study right now, planning and design. I wouldn't say call it a study, but planning and design, because I've actually seen some preliminary piping plans that collect that water that floods right there. It's basically on the Dairy Queen side of Cape and Open Drive. It collects it and takes it through a piping system through Alaska Avenue and discharges into the canal, or not into the canal, into the marsh that's at the base of Alaska Avenue. So, I haven't seen all the design calculations and don't know what they've been talking about in terms of tidal, tailwater, and those things, which we will get into that with them. But it's good to know that DelDOT's working on that because it's inside their right-of-way on Cape and Open Drive, and they're looking to capture that rain runoff, because that's not really tidal issues, that's rain that collects there, and get it out of there into the marsh area. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention as well. And that's everything I had. I've got my contact information there. If you want to drop me a question or a comment, please feel free to do so.
I see Jim Baker has his hand up.
Hey, Charlie, just a couple quick questions. Obviously, like the city's philosophy is to collect the stormwater in the entire city of watershed and put it in the canal or into Canary Creek. How does that affect flooding? And also, have you guys like calculated the amount of discharge that comes from the stormwater runoff during a normal storm event?
For the total, like in total for the city?
You got it. Like, I mean, how does part A is, does the stormwater runoff being discharged directly into the canal and also Canary Creek affect flooding of those areas, especially down in the canal area and all the roads that you showed on your slide that had flooding, which was due to the canal or Canary Creek? And is there some sort of calculation as far as the quantity of water, the volume of water that is discharged into the canals, into the creeks during a flood event, or during a storm event, during a regular rain event?
No, I don't have that in total for the entire city. I would have it probably for some of the drainage areas that I've worked on where we're making improvements. But that would be like, spotty across the city, not for a total, cubic foot per second rate that goes into the canal.
Okay, so for those areas that you do have the information on, are they the beach areas, or are they the areas where it's more paved, like on the city side, and there's more of a collection system?
I think it varies a little bit. Like when we did the Washington Avenue project in 1999, we ran all the stormwater management calculations, and I can dig that number out to know exactly how much water runs through those pipes. And similarly, what we would expect at that Nebraska and Iowa Avenue project, where we combine the porous with the catch basin and pipe discharge to the canal, I would have an understanding, but I don't have those numbers on the right at my fingertips.
Okay.
But I think I understand your point that it's kind of good to have some sense of how much water is going in there and what its effect might be on, I think you're saying like during a surge tide, are we making it worse, or how much worse are we making it?
You're right. And then also kind of another question, is there, which kind of wraps around all of this, but is there a cost, do you know a cost differential between porous pavement and a traditional pavement if you were to do a new street replacement today?
Oh, yeah, and on the conservative side, I'm going to say it runs 40 to 50% more than a traditional asphalt street. And remember when I talked about that a porous pavement system has a really engineered stone underbase that is necessary for that whole system to work. The way I've always thought about it, Jim, is that yes, it is 40 to 50% more expensive, but it also, at first when we started using porous, we would always think of it as just a street. But it's important to remember that it's a stormwater management device as well because of its infiltration capacity. So you're paying more for the asphalt, but you're gaining a lot on the stormwater side.
Right.
Yeah, but it runs 40 to 50% generally more expensive.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Keena, you had your hand up first, but you put it down. And do you still have something? And then Rodney, I saw yours as well.
There we go. Jim asked my question, so that's why.
Perfect.
My main thing was to know what the consequences are if everything's being drained into the canal, and it's been reported that the difficulty for the flooding on the beach side is coming from the canal. It's kind of obvious that we should probably have those answers.
Okay, Rodney and then Marta. And then I do want to make sure we leave time for Janelle for her presentation as well.
One question I have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Is when you do the system for porous paving, I assume you have a thicker stone layer you get for storage capacity underneath of that?
Yeah, and you actually have two different kinds of stone. One is a larger, and it's
Right.
very important that it's sort of like crusher run. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
I am.
but it's completely washed, Rodney, of the fines.
Right.
And then there's also a intercepting layer of smaller stone that's also washed of its fines at the top that sort of captures it and spreads whatever drainage infiltrates through the asphalt into the underlying larger crusher unwashed stone.
And the pipes that then, that you use for the catch basins, the piping system, is it just for conveyance, or do you oversize it and get any storage capacity out of that?
Generally, there's a little bit of storage capacity in there just because of the way they're shaped. We don't design them to run full, but we only design them to handle, certain expectations of storms, like 10-year storms.
Right.
Otherwise, you start having these gigantic sized pipes that are just cost ineffective.
Okay.
So I think to answer your question, we've got, some, they're not filled to the brim when we design them. There's some conservancy in them so that they can handle more than the design storm.
So your stormwater management is really, is it fair to say that it's kind of two kinds? One is on a watershed-to-watershed basis, trying to collect stormwater, either get it back into the ground or convey it to the canal as quickly as possible. But the other real challenge is, since everything's going to the canal, when you have a surge tide situation, kind of all bets are off in a way about watersheds because they can't go anywhere. The canal's full and it just can't get out.
Yeah, now we don't have as many problems on the city side because the elevations on the city
Higher.
side don't create that problem, but it's absolutely a consideration whenever we do some kind of design on the beach side that includes an outfall to the canal.
So all the development that's occurring around the city, like Tower Hill, for example, is going to be adding more water to the marsh that has to get to the canal to get out during a surge. Is that fair to say?
Well, the way stormwater management systems on a development like that are designed is that they're designed to actually manage the stormwater that falls on the post-development conditions with all the impervious area created by the roads, the houses, and everything else. Manage that and release it at the pre-development rate, at least
Right.
up to the 10-year storm event.
It's a 10-year storm, though. That's the threshold.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, yes, for that, but also they have to at least also have a release for a 100-year storm that doesn't create damage to adjacent properties. And I know that takes all sorts of forms, but that is the statewide regulation.
Okay. Thank you.
But
Marta and then Joe, and then I think we really do need to move on to Janelle, but there'll be still time at the end.
Okay, just a quick add-on to that. I think around Near Road, in fact, near where I live, I wonder if the Canary Creek is, when it gets full, bringing water onto our property. Sometimes we've had it 75 feet into our yard, our front yard. But my question was, are there other practical alternatives to discharging water to the canal and creek? I know Rehoboth Beach, I guess, discharges to the ocean. That has its own controversial issues, I'm sure. Are there land-based things? I'm sure we don't have land for that, but I'm just trying to see if there's other practical alternatives.
well, stormwater's, we're a little focused on stormwater quantity. There's also a quality component to stormwater runoff, and there's a lot of things you can do in terms of stormwater quality improvements, even if you end up having a discharge to the canal like we utilize right now. You can create upstream quality improvement structures and devices and alternatives. I don't want to scare you by structures and devices, but there's various things you can do upstream that creates better quality as it enters into the canal, which is a very important component. But in terms of quantity, yeah, there probably are, Marta. Certainly infiltration and best management practices where they can be utilized is the first place you want to start, because there's a lot of different best management practices. Things that can work everywhere from a whole road, like we've been talking about today, to things that work in people's backyards or front yards that really help the overall system once you start getting those in place everywhere around the city. In terms of like collecting it and discharging it 800 feet into a confined aquifer, I'm not too aware of anything around our area where you've done that. It's very expensive to do that. But right now, our alternatives for quality or quantity control are existing stormwater management systems that are, really fleshed out by the state and the engineering community. And they include these best management practices.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and then Joe.
Charlie, I assume you have contacted the state about possibly making Cedar Avenue permeable. And my understanding is that some of the infrastructure along Cedar Avenue could also be replaced, converting iron or steel pipes to PVC. What are your thoughts on all that?
So I have not personally spoken to anybody at DelDOT about upgrading that street. And one thing that you have to consider with Cedar Avenue, it's a different classification of street. Where we've been putting porous on Bay Avenue, Odessa Avenue, New Hampshire, Bayview, they're very relatively lightly traveled, lightly loaded roads. And you have to be careful. We'd have to really talk to DelDOT, and I think the city and the board intend to do that over time, about considering some sort of permeable paving system, but whether it would really be suited for that sort of what I call secondary collector road that has so much more travel, especially in the summertime, than some of these side roads. So just keep that in mind. In terms of the pipes, I'm just beginning to get my head wrapped around what they have out there. I know the board, city, and I are just signing up for a GIS database that DelDOT has that will show us exactly what catch basins and pipes they have everywhere in Lewes, not just Cedar Avenue. So once I get my head wrapped around that data, those improvements that you were talking about, which I know some are necessary, I can probably better answer that question, but I don't have a tremendous feel for it right now.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Okay, and with that, we're going to keep this moving along in the interest of time and hand this over to Janelle for the presentation on comparison and regulations.
I'm just bringing it up right now.
Why don't you sit and I'll, well, I think,
Oh, you got that.
I didn't see that you had it.
All right, let me just share the screen real quick. So what I did is I kind of built off of my last presentation and kind of took a look at what other towns, the coastal towns, are doing in the area. So I just put kind of something that we can kind of build on and take a look at. Like that, there we go. So what I did is I looked at some of the coastal towns, Rehoboth, Dewey, Ocean View, Slaughter Beach, South Bethany, Bowers, Henlopen Acres, and just looked at like some of the zoning information that I started with my last presentation, and took a look at, what are the lot coverages between the cities, and then how does it compare to the city of Lewes, which is in the far right corner.
Can't see.
You can see it on that screen there.
Okay, all right,
Yeah,
good.
but you can't see that screen.
Okay,
Wow.
yeah. Tom, maybe, can you run over and dim the lights a little bit, maybe? Thank you.
So I just took a look at, what are the other towns doing, and how does Lewes compare? Because last time I just kind of went and looked at, like, hey, this is what Lewes is doing, what type of things can, as a jumping off point, the items that we can look at. And again, I think this is an area that we can add to. In our column, the first column is kind of the categories I broke it down to. What's the maximum lot coverage of the towns? What's the minimum lot size? And again, that's a range from 4,800 square feet to 12,500, but the majority of the residential zoning districts were 5,000, which is what the city has in multiple zoning districts of a lot cover, of a minimum lot size. What's the maximum building height? I know we've had a number of questions about that. And again, it ranges from 30 feet all the way up to 42 feet. And again, some of them actually look at, if you're in the floodplain or outside the floodplain, if you are going to do freeboard, they increase with an additional freeboard. I looked at the number of stories. Some of them didn't have any. I looked at the setbacks just to kind of, because we talked about, the building area on a property, and I know we've kind of noticed that, everybody's kind of maxing it out, and, you can kind of see, so FY is your front yard, the SY is your side yard, and the RY is your rear yard, and I can send this out to everybody so they can take a look at it. Typically, if there's a second number, it typically means there's an aggregate. So some of them have you have to have a 6-foot side yard, but between both of your side yards, you have to have 16 feet. In Henlopen Acres, you actually have an aggregate between your front yard and your rear yard, which is a little bit different. I looked at across the board what freeboard was. It ranges from 1 feet up to 3 feet, and it's all over the place at 2 feet. And some if you want to go higher in your building height, you increase the amount of freeboard. Some of the things we looked at. Does it require freeboard, or does the code require freeboard required if you're gonna fill? Some places it was no, some places it was yes. Do some of the towns require the VE standards and the AE standards, which is something that Jen had brought up, is something we could look at. Some places I wasn't able to find anything, so we keep looking. Do they require the freeboard in the 500 year? Some of them were no. What I found rather interesting going through some of the towns was actually they have a requirement for natural area and green space on properties. So you might have a lot coverage, but they're also saying you have to provide open space on the property and a percentage of the open space. So I thought that was interesting, so I just added it to the list, and I think as we continue to move forward, these are items we can continue to add items to our list and see what makes sense for the city of Lewes, what doesn't make sense for the city of Lewes, as we're looking at making the city more resilient, and we move forward to further protect the city. I think we can continue to add, if there's other ideas like that, Jen brought up today was the disclosure. We can add that to the list. Is that something we want to consider for the city of Lewes? Is that something that anybody else considers? So I think this is just a growing document to go over of things that we can change, things that we have the ability to change, things that we can look at so the city can help become more resilient, as the mayor said in the beginning of the presentation. So if there's ideas that you have, or if there's ideas that you want to take a look at, these are things I think to start thinking about some ideas that we can start turning into, is that something we want to look at towards the code? Is there something that we want to look at as we move forward in the decisions as we move forward? And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. Does anybody have any questions? I can't see everybody. Marta, go ahead.
Did you also happen to look at the other thing that has been discussed about how much improvements or improvements would be existing homes need to also go by these rules, these regulations? I don't know if I said that clearly enough.
So typically what happens is this would apply to new houses as we move forward, or if you tear something down and rebuild it, because what the code has, I'm going to call it grandfathered. If the city adopts something and a house doesn't meet the current requirements, then it's grandfathered in. And then if something happens and it doesn't become grandfathered, like, hey, I'm going to do some work on the property, or I'm going to tear it down and start over, then it would have to come into compliance with the code. And that's really, something that, I think a lot of people forget is we do have rules and regulations that say, hey, you're non-conforming, you're grandfathered in, and then in the future, if one of these criteria, you lose your nonconformity, then you have to comply with the rules and regulations. So it doesn't go, oh, tomorrow you have to do this. Nope, it's at some point your nonconformity is triggered, and then you have to comply. And sometimes I've seen it where some houses, after 50 years, still are nonconforming because they haven't done something that requires them to trigger the conformity.
Right. I guess I was wondering if you looked at what triggers it in those coastal towns. I think there was some talk about here, maybe of over a number of years, if you had a 50%, I don't know, I'm not exact on the figures, but do most towns have something like that?
So all the towns have a substantial damage and a substantial improvement requirement. That is the definition from FEMA. The city and both Bethany Beach have a cumulative effect that says we look at the building permits over the last 10 years. Again, for the city, we've only had one house been impacted by that. We haven't had any other house that I'm aware of been impacted by the cumulative 10-year impact of that. But both Bethany Beach and the city both have that.
Thank you.
Great. Joe, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, of course, the Fenwick, Dewey, South Bethany, Rehoboth do not have that. And when I looked at the Bethany code, although they have the provision, they have other provisions that are set forth later in their code, which make it very clear that if you have a non-conforming use, then you do not have to, in effect, comply with this cumulative cost provision. You can look at that. I think it sounds like to me they just adopted what FEMA has suggested, but in terms of real application, it's not being applied. And you mentioned, Janelle, one person. Well, I know several people that are very concerned about that, and it seems to me that you shouldn't thrust people involuntarily into new freeboard requirements. I mean, I don't know what the committee's going to decide, but it's likely, I guess, it's going to be increase in freeboard. So I think we need to really take a look at that substantial improvement ordinance, and it's not limited to flooding. It's if you have repairs owing to wind damage or other a fire or something, you're forced into these flood control provisions. It just doesn't seem to me to be fair to existing homeowners. I think people make the best decision whether they want to rebuild or not rebuild, and they shouldn't be compelled to do so by this cumulative cost provision over 10 years.
Okay, so let's, keep focusing forward on the list of, building our list of potential strategies that we want to look at, and that's one of the things we'll be focusing on at our next meeting. But why don't you, Rodney, go ahead if you have
If I may, I just have one quick question. It was mentioned earlier on, I think Charlie talked about a resiliency fund in Bethany.
That was in my presentation,
Where
yes.
you talked about it. What was the resiliency fund? What does that cover? Do you know?
So I don't have a lot of the detail. I know it is a property tax. Phil, do you want to speak to that? We'll make sure we get the facts right.
So the city of Bethany, I think in 2017, by unanimous vote of council, approved an increase in property tax rates with the surplus going into a special fund. I can't remember the exact name of it. It's called the Resiliency Reserve Fund, something like that. I can provide the direct link to the information in the city code, but and it's also in their budget. You can actually go and look on Bethany Beach's budget, and you'll see how much is in there. I think at this point there's $4 or $5 million in there that they have, and that was designed. If I'm remembering what Luke Kilmer told me, it was designed to allow the city to quickly recover from any kind of disaster and use that money for disaster preparedness and immediate recovery.
Phil, I think they may have also used some of that money to acquire some land for an open park.
Okay, so that's another possibility.
We can look at, I'll talk to Lou about it, but you and I both probably need to talk to Lou.
Yeah, but it's in theory, the policy is raise revenue to create a special fund, and then you could recommend what to do with that additional revenue, or council would have some discretion there as well.
Thank you.
It doesn't need to be for immediate disaster preparedness and recovery. You could use it for stormwater infrastructure, property acquisitions, those kinds of things.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee before we open it up to the public? I don't see anybody here. Okay. Does anyone from the public have comments or questions on any of the presentations or discussion today? Quiet again.
No, there aren't any.
Okay. No, all right. So, Phil.
Phil's got a comment.
Oh, Marta?
How many are in the public? Did we already say that? I don't remember.
We have on Zoom, we have 9 people. I don't know about in person.
We don't have any members of the public with us today in person.
Okay. Good question, Marta. Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, so I do have a question. Actually, since there is time, I didn't want to ask it because I didn't want to occupy time, but it seems we do have time. It's a question for Charlie. Charlie, when you develop the hydrologic models to figure out drainage for a certain coverage, a certain area of the city, do you consider the impact of future development within that drainage area? And to what extent? Because I would presume that there are certain lots that are undeveloped. There's certain areas that are undeveloped. And how much do you consider the impact of additional future development when you develop your hydrologic models and your stormwater designs?
Yeah, we consider it entirely like it's totally built out, based on the zoning requirements and lot coverage and that sort of thing. So we assume that those are, because you don't want to put a system in the ground that's, obsolete 5 years later when homes have been built. Now, fortunately for me, inside the city, there's some infill left, but there's really, not a whole lot that's going to affect the inner city piping system. We get more into it when we start to expand our services. But yeah, we definitely consider them as full build out based on whatever the regulations allow.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Perfectly. Yes.
Great. Okay. Joe, Kelly, go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Joe.
Janelle just committed to give the entire mobilization luncheon.
Charlie and Tower Hill, I assume they have some, either a wet pond or a dry pond to capture larger discharges. My experience with some of these wet ponds that despite allegedly being able to withstand 100-year storm events, I don't know what is a 100-year storm event, but they overflow and cause flooding. I'm just wondering how carefully, I know it's not your jurisdiction, but how carefully Sussex County has looked at that.
Well, I have not looked at Tower Hill's stormwater management system because it's outside the city and et cetera. But my experience with SCD is that they're very thorough, and that I know when I've had my own projects have to go through their stormwater management review process, it's not getting through on the first go-around. I have many iterations to get through. They have really good comments, and it's not easy. So, I mean, to answer your question, I'd say SCD does a really, really good job of reviewing plans and making sure that the developer meets the requirements of the state.
Thanks.
I did want to add a little bit regarding, I think it was Jim Baker's question about, determining the amount of rainfall runoff getting into the canal and Canary Creek systems, how does that affect flooding? I just wanted to put this out there that when we have major tidal surges from nor'easters or other sorts of storms like that with their northeast winds blowing in through the inlet, raising the levels in the canal and the creek, the amount of rainfall runoff is kind of a very, very small percentage of the tidal surge coming in from the Delaware Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. So please put that in the back of your mind, that yes, there is runoff from rainfall during storm events, and if there's a storm event and a tidal surge that combined at the same time, it can have some effect, but really the major effect on that kind of tidal surge flooding is from the surge from the bay and from the Atlantic Ocean. So please keep that in mind.
Great, thank you, Charlie. I think Joe or Jim actually had to leave a little bit early today. There is one question from the public that was typed in the Q&A. Regarding the Washington Avenue watershed, does that managed pipe stormwater discharge into the White's Pond before it is carried to the outfall into the canal? I think you can probably... Oh, Anne-Marie's going to answer that one. Great.
What?
Oh,
I was thinking Charlie was going to answer that.
I'm sorry, it just the way it popped up in the Q&A. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, it does actually. It enters into that White's Pond, and then White's Pond overflows into the next set of ditches that runs across the agricultural field, Gills Neck Road, and finally discharges through a pipe into the canal.
I'd just like to add something to what Charlie said before. While Sussex County Conservation District does a very good job at reviewing plans, they review them to the state requirements, which is 10 years for water quality and 100-year for maximum storm capacity. And as we've been hearing recently from all the forecasts, the 10-year and 100-year events are all historically based. So, you know, they do what they're chartered to do, but their charter is limited.
Great. Thank you for that, Tom. Phil?
Another question. Charlie, are you city engineer for any of the other communities along the beaches, any of the towns that Janelle had in her list?
So GMB, not me specifically, but GMB does work with South Bethany, Millville, a little bit of work with Ocean View, Henlopen Acres, but not to the level that we're involved with
Lewes.
with the city of Lewes.
Because I'm wondering how Lewes compares in terms of the cost of stormwater management for Lewes compared to those other communities on an area basis. Like if Lewes has a higher volume per area, requires more engineering per area, or less compared to some of those other communities.
You know, I'm only guessing, but I'd say, like, if you look at Rehoboth, it's probably very similar, because they probably have a similar collection system. They discharge to the canal, they discharge to the ocean. I would guess it's similar. You know, when you're talking about South Bethany, they've got their own set of issues. I know years ago I did a best management practice study for them. And they've got issues because they've got the Indian River Bay coming up to their backyard there that keeps rising and flooding into their canals that people all along South Bethany on the west side as you travel down Route 1, you know, their homes are right up against those canals, and I know that was a problem for them. So that's a little bit, it's kind of like our canal problem, but I think it may even be a little worse down there.
And that's a discharge issue. I'm wondering about like runoff, drainage and runoff to get into the stormwater system, like as a.
Yeah, I mean, even South Bethany, as far as I know, I mean, it's been a long time since I've worked there, they have a similar catch basin and piping collection discharge system. And I would say that's probably the case. I think Lewes is a little bit more on the cutting edge in terms of its utilization of permeable pavement and other infiltration practices, but, you know, those other towns are doing well too.
Great, thank you. Bradley?
Just very quickly, how vulnerable is the sewage treatment plant here to flooding, Charlie?
So, I mean, it might be a question for the Board of Public Works, but my knowledge of it is that the critical infrastructure at the wastewater treatment plant is placed above the 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
And there might be some minor infrastructure that gets flooded during a 100-year flood, but the critical infrastructure, like the process, the generator, all the electric transformers and power provisions, they're all set above the 100-year floodplain plus, not just right at the 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is Tom Panetta, and as I had indicated in prior meetings, the BPW is looking at the wastewater treatment plant and its vulnerabilities and potential methods for building resiliency into it.
Yeah. And as we set this program up, we excluded that from the discussion, so thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, we are right at 5:30.
Yep.
And so I don't see anything else. So our next meeting is November 9th, same time.
I see one question on the Q&A.
Oh, I missed something, sorry. Okay, well, let me just real quickly go through that, and then maybe we can grab that question real quick. So our next meeting is on November 9th, same time, same place. At that meeting, we're really going to be focusing on both the table that Janelle reviewed today, as well as the strategies, best practices that I reviewed in the last presentation. So I'll be sending both of those out to you, and I just encourage the committee members to look them over, so that at the next meeting, we can really kind of focus on, look at the ones that you're really interested in talking about over the next few meetings, right? We have to kind of say, these are on the board, these are on the table, these are secondary, and prioritize how we're going to go forward. This is really up to the committee members and how we want to move forward and what we want to move forward. And we hope that the tables will help you to be able to wrap your head around all of those different options, or potentially any that aren't on there yet.
And just to reiterate, Jan, that this is that we want to be forward-thinking rather than reactionary to things that are where we currently are. Okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. We're not going to be discussing anything that's going to reduce the effectiveness of existing regulations. So, last question, it's actually a two-parter. In the locations where streets currently run off to catch basins and pipes, then to daylight at canal outfalls, this might be easier for you directly, Charlie, rather than me reading it, but is that runoff being treated for quality prior to being discharged into the canal, is question number one. And then number two is, does pervious paving treat water for quality prior to allowing water to infiltrate into the ground?
So, to answer question number one, there are upstream retention ponds, detention ponds, best management practices that are local to a specific property that treat for quality and then discharge into the city's stormwater collection system that ultimately discharges into the canal. The city itself, on, say, Mulberry Street, it collects the runoff, but it doesn't treat it. It just, that runoff ends up going into the canal. And that's something that I'm certain that's going to be looked at over time. In terms of the porous and permeable paving, infiltration is one of the best water quality, stormwater management devices that we have. So it is in itself a water quality, stormwater quality approach. It's not, obviously, when rainwater hits that porous pavement, it's not treated in any way before it goes, any particular way before it goes through the asphalt and into the underlying stone system and underlying soils below that. I hope that helps.
Great, well, thank you. Okay, and again, thank everyone for their attendance today. Great questions, great discussion, and we'll have some follow-up materials coming your way from us so that we can really be prepared for the next meeting on November 9th. With that, we'll take a motion to adjourn. And
I move to adjourn.
Great. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan and Joel. Thank you. All right.
Just to clarify, our hearing tonight is at 6:30?
Yes.
Okay.